Hi.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another exciting edition of Living at Your Highest Quality of Life with us at Inspire Wellness. Dan Nitis with.
Jessica Hutchins.
Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you staying connected on Facebook and sending us your ideas for future Facebook Lives. And
Thank
so
you.
at the end of this presentation, we'll tell you what next week's topic is going to be about. Also want to remind you about the farmers markets. So during the summer, we'll keep reminding you every so often about the importance of supporting our local farmers, especially those who are trying to grow organic. And it's just a great opportunity to meet people in the community as well as get real food. So again, please participate. Really important.
And remember also with the farmers markets, they don't actually have to say organic to not use any herbicides or pesticides. So talk to the farmers themselves and see if maybe they run a nice organic-ish farm. They just don't pay the money to get the certification. So there's lots of ways around just finding an organic certified farm.
Great. So what are we talking about today?
We're talking about gluten and how to live a gluten-free life, how to start off living a gluten-free life. Because once you've been doing it for a while, it becomes pretty easy and no extra work. But at first, people are extremely overwhelmed, especially if they've never seen anyone in their family have to go on special dietary restrictions. So we're going to talk about that in the context of non-celiac gluten sensitivity and also celiac, because it is kind of the same idea at the beginning to try to find foods that are gluten-free.
So great. So can you actually explain what you mean by non-celiac gluten sensitivity and what is the difference between that and celiac? Maybe perhaps start with what celiac is and how you make that diagnosis, and then what's the difference for people who don't have celiac but are impacted by gluten.
Right. So celiac is an autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks certain parts of the cells of the villi of the cells that line the gut. And non-celiac gluten sensitivity is pretty much anybody who knows they have a gluten sensitivity who doesn't have the diagnosis of celiac. We are finding now that some people, they think it's non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but 5 years down the road, they'll get a diagnosis of celiac. So really it's anything besides celiac where you have gluten sensitivity. And I know we wanted to, let me back up. So as far as the non-celiac gluten sensitivity, so people can have symptoms like fatigue, joint pain, headaches, skin rashes, certainly bloating, diarrhea, constipation, just about any kind of chronic symptom. It can be immediately after they eat gluten. It can be up to a couple days later. And if you eat gluten all the time and you're affected by it, you might just have a chronic low-grade inflammation that results in chronic all the time symptoms. So it might not be that easy to tell as soon as you eat something and you have a symptom, because you might not always have that symptom directly after you eat. So some of the ways that we test for it are things like elimination diets and food sensitivity tests, which we might mention later as well. And then some of the celiac tests, the gold standard test for that is a small bowel biopsy, which obviously not everybody has. You can also do blood tests and look for gliadin antibodies. You can look for endomysial antibodies and tissue transglutaminase antibodies. And certainly if you have all three of those present, I would say immediately, get off gluten, go talk to a GI doctor and a functional medicine doctor and get your body back in check and stop the autoimmune process. But for both celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity patients, still, again, the foundation is getting off of gluten 100%, at least for short term, and in non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and see what happens, see how you feel.
So let's discuss some of the myths that we know that are out there when you look online or when patients come to us and they're providing information as far as what their understanding is regarding both celiac and then non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So what are some of the myths that we wanted to discuss? So the first one would be only people with celiac need to be concerned about gluten. Is that true or false?
Right. So some people say that, oh, well, not eating gluten is just a fad. You're following that fad diet, just like everyone was following the Atkins diet or a low-fat diet in the 80s. So the bottom line is, if you know you feel better not eating gluten, and you know that symptoms flare when you eat gluten, who cares? It doesn't matter what it's called. Just stop eating gluten and don't pay attention to the idea that it might be a fad, because it is what it is. If you feel bad with it, then it's not good for your body right now.
Okay, so that's good. And then what about the myth that there's just not enough foods if you're trying to go gluten free to
Oh,
choose
right.
from? So it's a very limited exposure.
Right. So some people say that, that if everything has gluten in it, right? They go to the store and they can't find anything gluten free except for maybe cookies in the gluten free section. Well, the truth is, most real food doesn't have gluten in it, right? The wheat, barley, and rye are the foods that have the inflammatory gluten proteins that we talk about with non-celiac gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. So there are tons of foods out there without labels that are gluten free. You got to be careful. You don't want to just go towards the gluten-free labeled foods because those are all processed foods that are usually high in sugar with sometimes inflammatory oils and things like
Okay. And then the last one would be, I think you started to mention it, that we wanted to highlight that gluten is only wheat. So you mentioned barley and rye. Is it in any other grains that we need to be
that.
concerned
I mean,
about?
the actual gluten protein, there is a form of gluten that is in other grains, but the ones that we really need to be concerned about are in wheat, barley, and rye. And then also, we can talk about other foods that they may be hidden in as well. It's not just stopping breads and pastas. There's a lot of processed foods that have gluten in them. Soy sauce has gluten in it. Tamari does not. Some mustards, especially mustards that are made with either malt vinegar or beer, can have gluten in them. Candies can have gluten in them. Supplements can have gluten in them. Shampoos, lotions. Gluten is like a glue. That's kind of where the name comes from. So it binds things together. So anything that needs to be held together might have a little bit of gluten in it.
And for people who make bread, it's what makes bread sticky, right? So
Right.
when you're working with the dough, that stickiness is actually gluten itself. So one thing that I also wanted to mention was that both of us are wedded to the idea of being gluten-free, and we certainly empathize with people who are either dealing with celiac or are on this path of non-celiac gluten sensitivities and trying to find an appropriate diet or nutritional guidelines for them. And so, we recognize that there are challenges associated with this. Most of the processed foods that you get in your grocery stores may have some wheat or some aspect of gluten in them. So it does make it a bit difficult. However, what we're trying to get patients to recognize is the importance of eating real food, food without labels. And if it doesn't have a label on it, more than likely we're going to be dealing with um, food items that don't contain gluten. So for me, it's been a path about 2 years. For you, it's been much longer than that, correct?
Mm-hmm. Say maybe 5 to 7 years.
So yeah, especially in the beginning, it can definitely be a challenge. But we're here to support you any way that we can and recognize that the importance of doing this is to reduce inflammation that's being introduced into the body. And that should help us reduce or eliminate a chronic disease from developing, correct?
Right, correct. And I just thought of another myth as well that some people say, well, it must not be gluten itself. If people can go to other countries like Europe, continents and like Europe and eat gluten and feel fine and not have the same symptoms. But the bottom line is, most of us here are in the United States, and whatever the gluten is, however it's made, however it's developed, however it's processed with Roundup and glyphosate, that's what makes us sick. So, whether it's the gluten protein, whether it's the glyphosate, it doesn't matter. I don't think in the long run, specifically, just still stop eating it if it makes you feel bad.
So I thought maybe we could talk about some of the kind of conventional, um, we'll go with misnomers, or it's more than myths, but what does the current medical community say about gluten and as it relates to diet? So the first one is if you don't have celiac, then gluten is okay.
Right. And that's obviously, probably half of the people listening will know that in their bodies, gluten is not okay. You can have different immune reactions that don't necessarily develop into an autoimmune process, but that still create a lot of inflammation for sure. And like we were saying before, the glyphosate, the enormous amount of glyphosate in gluten can really contribute to symptoms as well. So what is it about glyphosate and gluten? Why is there so much glyphosate on wheat products?
Well, I think at the end of the processing of the wheat itself, the they basically they're dousing the grain in glyphosate to remove it from the stalk.
Right. So after they even grow
Right.
it.
So after it's grown, it's then again it's reintroduced into the system. And so um, again, our concern as physicians and human beings is that we're seeing this dramatic increase in the rate of cancer. And go to the World Health Organization website, and you will see that glyphosate is listed as a potential cancer-causing agent. And so anything that we can do to reduce our risk is going to be critical if we are looking to reverse this trend of over half of the population developing cancer in their lifetime.
Right.
I thought maybe we could talk about testing. So if patients are concerned that they may have issues with gluten, what would be a way for them to get this diagnosis?
I mean, probably the gold standard test, in my opinion, for non-celiac gluten sensitivity is to try it out in your own body. So completely eliminate it for 30 days or more, like 100%, to get all of the inflammation and all the antibodies down. And then if you feel great, then keep going. If you're not sure if you feel any different, then reintroduce it. Maybe eat a couple, small amount, a couple different meals during the day, and notice any effects that it'll have. It can happen immediately. It can happen the next day. You can wake up achy, flu-like, have a headache, or even 2 days later, you can feel like you got hit by a truck. So that's probably the best way to know. But again, you really have to be 100% to see. It's like a chemistry experiment in your body. The other tests, besides the one I mentioned for celiac, which is the biopsy, the tissue transglutaminase antibodies, endomycin antibodies, and the deaminated gliadin protein antibodies, is IgG food testing. So we do a lot of that here. And we look for the immune system's response, the IgG part of the immune system's response to gluten antibodies, wheat antibodies, and other foods as well. But we see gluten show up a lot. And I would say 99 out of 100 times when it shows up, people feel a noticeable difference when they get off of the gluten. I mean, tests aren't everything. They're not always 100%, but they do give us some data to start with and some motivation. Some people need data on paper to even start a lifestyle change that seems so hard as one like this.
So again, just reminding you the difference between IgG testing, which is sensitivity testing, and IgE, which is the antibody that we see associated with allergies. So when people have a true allergy and could potentially develop an anaphylactic reaction, we tend to see the IgE. So this testing is specifically for IgG. No less important, it's still creating inflammation. And we know that it's inflammation that drives the chronic disease train. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention inability to detoxify and deficiencies of vitamins and minerals, making up your trifecta of what drives the chronic disease in the United States. Recognizing that we're up against it time-wise and we want to be partial to your day as well, just wanted to briefly go over a case of a 49-year-old who came in to see me, a male who was having challenges with weight loss. And so as part of the workup, we did recognize there were some digestive-related issues. We did an IgG panel and found that he had very high antibody responses to the different categories that were tested for wheat. And after we removed the inflammatory components of the diet, wheat being the main driver, and had this person eating real food, after 4 months, had a 35-pound weight loss. Wow. So again, this is how we are able to get the body back to balance. This is really about balance and equilibrium, is identifying where the inflammation is coming from, removing it, helping the body detoxify, and replacing any deficiencies of vitamins and minerals. So that was a really important success story that we see, but this is what we see, these patterns over and over and over again. So the importance is, if you are having challenges with any type of a chronic problem, identify where the inflammation is coming from, and oftentimes it's going to be from food.
Right.
So we also wanted to quickly mention about recipes, websites, books that can help you, because this is not a path that is going to be easily taken on your own. So there's lots of support out there. What do you recommend as far as websites or textbooks?
So there's an app that I like to use when I'm out of town that I used a lot when we traveled, with little kids. It's called Find Me Gluten Free. It's free. You just type in your location, and it'll list all the restaurants either that have gluten-free menus or that are 100% gluten-free or that offer gluten-free choices. And then people can actually write reviews on them. And so I think a couple of times I've seen reviews like, oh, well, I said I wanted an all gluten-free meal and the waiter brought me a basket of bread. So in that kind of restaurant, obviously they're not completely understanding what gluten is, and it might not be the safest place to go, especially if you have celiac disease. Some of my favorite cookbooks are Everyday Paleo from Sarah Fragoso. And if you go to sarahfragoso.com, it's SARAHFA or FRAGA, I'm sorry, FRAGOSO.com. She has a lot of free recipes, and then her book, Everyday Paleo, I cook from probably every week. Then also Carol Lovett made ditchthewheat.com, and she has recipe books and free recipe ideas as well. She also has a guide to eating gluten-free while you travel, because that's something that, big airports more and more these days are having, more gluten-free options, but you can't be stuck at an airport with no food, because then you're going to eat whatever's in front of you. So, nuts, beef jerky, maybe a little to-go hummus container with some cut-up vegetables and things like that for travel. But like I said, she has that. And then eatingwell.com has a gluten-free shopping guide, and it kind of goes over the different places in the grocery store that gluten might be hidden, and deli meats are a big one that no one thinks of. I know Applegate has brands that specifically say gluten-free, but you want to watch out for stuff like that. So those are some of the websites. Also nourishinghope.com. Julie Matthews, she's a wonderful child nutritionist and deals a lot with gluten-free diets within the autism and ADHD population. So there's a lot of resources out there for sure. And then Facebook has a lot of gluten-free groups. I think there's even a gluten-free in Cleveland group on Facebook for people to help each other out. And then locally, Cafe Avalon is completely gluten-free. Town Hall has a lot of gluten-free things. A lot of restaurants these days have a lot of gluten-free items out there.
Nice shout out to some of our favorite restaurants.
I know I'm forgetting some, sorry.
Well, I know we've gone a couple minutes over, so just wanted to remind you, we have a lot more information on our website, www.inspirewellnessmd.com. Again, want to thank you for your support and your suggestions and staying in contact with us. All right, so next week, by popular demand, as we are inching closer and closer to the go live date for medical cannabis in Ohio, our topic next week finally will be the truth about medical cannabis with your doctors at Inspire Wellness. Both are certified to prescribe and anxious to help patients who have chronic inflammation as a result of one or more of those conditions that are indicated, which we will discuss next week, what the indications are, but looking forward to finally having that conversation with you all.
Yep.
So again, thanks so much for participating with us today. Hope you have a great rest of the week. Remember, it's your time to thrive. Let us inspire you.
Bye.
Take care. Have a great week.